Once again, welcome and thank you for joining us for Land of Hope and Dreams. This event has been a year and a half in the making, and over the next 3 weeks, we've got 16 panels and spotlight conversations highlighting all aspects of Dave's work, his life, and his impact on the world. And while music journalism is at the center of that story, we wanted to make sure that Land of Hope and Dreams held true to Dave's never-ending quest to build bridges between the worlds of music, politics, healthcare, and social justice. Our speakers come from everywhere, but all of them share a commitment and passion to that same vision. Before we move into tonight's discussion, though, I'd like to thank my fellow steering committee members, the folks who are responsible for putting this amazing event together. I'd like to thank Danny Alexander, Chris Buhalis, Charles Hughes, Susan Martinez, Lauren Anke, Alexander Shashko, Craig Werner, and Daniel Wolf. And I just realized I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Eric Schumacher Rasmussen. I've been helping put this together. Also want to acknowledge that David Cantwell was instrumental in helping get this idea off of the ground. I'd like to thank Steve Nathans-Kelly for his invaluable Zoom advice, which I will do my best to execute properly. And finally, I also want to note that as we celebrate Dave's work, for the last 50 years, he's been writing and talking about music, whether in magazines like Rolling Stone and Cream, or today on Sirius XM, talking about it. There is an anthology of his work since the 1980s in the works. So hopefully we'll get that, that will be coming out sometime later this year. I apologize if you hear my dog in the background, but I know that Dave Marsh loves dogs and he'll understand. I'd also like to thank our partners, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and the University of Wisconsin Afro-American Studies Department, for their help in promoting the event. The Rock Hall will also be playing the Spotlight conversation with Dave Marsh on their YouTube channel on May 14th. And all of these conversations will be simulcast on the Land of Hope and Dreams YouTube channel, where they will also be archived. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge the work of the Kristen Ann Carr Foundation, something that Dave and his wife, Barbara, have been instrumental in setting up and running for the last 20 plus years, raising money for sarcoma research. This event is free, but if you have a mind to contribute some money, a contribution to the Kristen Ann Carr Fund would be most welcome, and you can find a link on the Land of Hope and Dreams website. Now, on to tonight's conversations. Dave Marsh and Pete Townshend have been friends and sparring partners since the 1970s, maybe the 1960s. And Dave's commitment to honesty was evident in his No Holds Barred biography of The Who, Before I Get Old. So it's only fitting that we begin Land of Hope and Dreams with a message from Pete Townshend. When we play this video, it will likely take over your entire screen. If you want to reduce the size of it on your screen, just go to the top of your Zoom window and click on More and have the option to exit full screen. Pete sent his message as an audio message only, and I'd like to thank Daniel Wolf and Marta Renzi for putting together the photo slideshow that goes with it. So with that, here's a message from Pete Townshend.
When one reaches a certain age and is famous, like me, and relatively healthy, one is often called to write eulogies for one's aging friends who were also in their dotage. I remember once meeting Lord Goodman, the great Labour peer, being asked to accompany the old chap to the toilet, where he announced that he had one piece of advice for me. "Pete," he said gravely, standing at the urinal, "don't grow old." I advised him that I'd already made a few bucks too, out of that notion, and asked him why he thought I should throw myself off a bridge before I reached his age. "Because old men can't piss properly." I know all these posh pronouns make me sound like Prince Charles, but this week, as he is often required to do, I have been called upon to do my duty to two very, very old men who've played a big part in my life and career, Dave Marsh and Keith Altham. I can't award either of them knighthoods, but I can pretend I think I really know them. Dave was a biographer of The Who, interviewed me on many occasions. Keith Altham was our publicist for many years. No doubt they have crossed paths, conspired to wring some juice out of the wrinkled, dry lemon that The Who, and myself as a part of it, has often appeared to be. But by the miracles of lies, money, frippery, fiction, absurdity and managerial brutality, the Who have survived to produce more acidic liquid, however insipid, and it seems, so have I, it's nice to be regarded as useful. So, to Dave Marsh. I think I probably met Dave in Detroit. He was then a founder of Cream magazine that survived, so it seemed then, by featuring Kiss on the cover every week for about 20 years. It's no wonder Dave ended up disliking them so much. Occasionally there might be glimpses of bands that were less appealing to the young Kiss fans, who mainly enjoyed, it seemed, looking at older men's tongues. The Who might then feature. Dave was not always kind to us. He wasn't always kind, period. It was about 50-50 with him, I think. His truth, his opinions and his critique were always sharply penned, and he expected great things from us, from me especially. He was literate and smart and regarded rock music as a new form of socio-political force that had massive potential for change for the better. Culturally, artistically and politically, I believed this too. It was hard for both of us to live up to. Compared to jazz, blues and folk music, so much rock was just self-serving blah. In later life, however, he's proved to be the most forgiving, loyal friend and advocate. We became especially close in 1993 when I was almost resident full-time in New York while Tommy was on Broadway. In the early part of that year, I attended a party as a patron to benefit the Kristen Ann Carr Fund. Kristen was Dave's stepdaughter who had died of cancer. Somehow, after 11 years of white-knuckle sobriety, that night I accepted a glass of Remy Martin cognac from a wily female fan, and the evening took flight, and so did I. That year was one of the happiest of my life, for a number of reasons, and it began with Dave and I sitting at a table talking about what really matters in life. Journalism, duty, truth, acquaintance, friendship, and finally family. I'm not sure we even mentioned music. Who was I talking about? Ah, yes, Dave Marsh. It's sad I can't be by his side so he can remind me of my worst behaviour, laugh and perhaps weep a little, because in the end, when you get to your late 70s, you realise that your best friends aren't always those you have seen often, but those who have cared about what you do and who you really are. I'm talking about me, of course, Dave caring about who I am and what I do. How many friends have I really got? I can count them on the one hand, I once wrote. And so, in memory of fine critique, good and bad, over the years, I hereby give Dave a finger.
Well, thank you to Pete Townshend for such an amazing look at Dave as a person, as a critic, and as a friend. And he's the reason we're all here. But we're here to talk about more than just Dave the person. We're here to talk about his ideas, his work, and his vision. But of course, those things are all inseparable. And over the next few weekends, we'll be talking about all aspects of Dave and everything he's done. One more housekeeping note or a reminder of a housekeeping note. The chat is disabled for the audience, but if you have a question for John Landau, please enter it in the Q&A box. If you raise your hand as an audience member, we will probably put it down for you just to keep our interface uncluttered here and ask you again, please put questions in the Q&A box in your Zoom window. And Caryn will present those questions, or some of them at least, to John after we play back his interview. Now, 2 weeks ago, author Caryn Rose sat down with John Landau for a conversation about everything from the early days of rock journalism to his work with the MC5, work that found Dave Marsh hovering at the outskirts, and then, of course, Dave Marsh's own work as a rock writer, as a journalist, as a critic, and his work as an advocate for cancer patients. Caryn Rose has written for Pitchfork, NPR Music, Vulture, and many other publications, and her book, Why Patti Smith Matters, will be published in early 2022. Caryn, please come on stage as it was. Welcome. How you doing tonight?
Hello, not bad. Glad to be here.
Glad to have you. Now, you have been a follower, like many of us, of Dave Marsh's work for how long? I mean, how did you get introduced to Dave's work, and how is your work intertwined with his over the years?
So I started reading him. I had a subscription to Rolling Stone at a very young age as a gift from my parents. So his byline became a thing that I looked for. I learned things from him. And then when I was in high school, towards senior year, I was writing for the school newspaper, and I decided that Dave Marsh certainly would care very much about what I had to say about The Who or the Rolling Stones or Bruce Springsteen, and I would send him clips. And he read them and wrote back to me. And that started at least a collegial type of friendship that we've maintained over the years. I really love his work, and it's been a real joy immersing myself in it, getting ready for this event.
And John Landau, of course, is a big part of that story. And when we asked you to interview John, you jumped at the chance. Why is John so important to our celebration of Dave Marsh here?
Well, they connect. John obviously talks about this, but they connected and intersected at a point in history that is near and dear to my heart, which is the beginning of music journalism and the alternative press. And they were there at the beginning when they were building it. And people ask John Landau a lot of questions about this guy from New Jersey he works with, but they don't necessarily ask him about that time. They also, again, as you mentioned, Dave was hovering at the edges when Mr. Landau was in Michigan producing the MC5, and someone should write a book about all of that because it's absolutely fascinating.
It sure is. And with that, I think we should just roll into the interview that you did with John. I do want to share a little inside baseball here. This was recorded a couple of weeks ago. Caryn came up with an amazingly well-researched set of questions and prompts for John, shared those with John ahead of time. And John did such an amazing job that during the interview, he pretty much ran the show, right? But these were questions that Caryn put together, and John's answers would not be the same without the questions Caryn put together ahead of time. So I just wanted to make sure that Caryn got props for that. And with that, here is Caryn's interview with John Landau.
Who does this guy think he is? Who's John Landau? As a critic, he was measured, very thoughtful, but he could take you down. That was the reaction of a young rock and roll musician named Bruce Springsteen upon reading an album review in Crawdaddy magazine, written by one of the earliest individuals to call themselves a rock critic. Mr. John Landau, who I'll be speaking with tonight, has been a music journalist and editor, a rock and roll musician, a record store clerk, a banjo aficionado, a record producer and artist manager, and was recently inducted as a member of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Working at Rolling Stone, where publisher Jan Wenner asked him, while he was still in college, to run his music reviews section, John assigned work to another pioneering music journalist out in Detroit named Dave Marsh. Their professional, musical, and personal lives have intertwined from approximately that point forward. If we had an audience, I'd say, please extend a warm welcome to John Landau.
Thank you very much, Caryn.
So I'd kind of like to set the scene for everyone. You're in college in Boston in the late 60s. You're still in school. You've been working in a record store. You've written for Crawdaddy, The Eye, and then Jan Wenner approached you about writing for Rolling Stone. Can you talk a little bit about that era, as like the notion of the counterculture and the alternative press and their impact?
Well, I really discuss it more, or think of it in more personal terms. For me, in the 60s, there were a few places where people were starting to write about rock music with some depth, some interest, some respect for the uniqueness of rock music. Daily newspaper coverage in most of America during the Beatles, Elvis, the whole period, were often assigned to non-music writers to cover the local concert as a news event. It was a lowly assignment. And in the 60s, vehicles for talking about rock music started to proliferate. One of them, oddly enough, was in a magazine called Hit Parader, where a fellow named Jim Delahunt, in this sort of teen magazine format, was interviewing, doing great interviews with the early English musicians who were coming over. Very in-depth things, so you took the information in the writing where you could find it. Of course, Richard Goldstein was the East Coast pioneer in the Village Voice, and was a good writer who befriended me when I was starting to explore the possibility of a career as a writer, and was a very courageous fellow. He expressed points of view that were anathema to the burgeoning fan base and a communication network about things. But in my particular case, in my particular case, the key thing was I was working at a music store in Harvard Square called Briggs and Briggs, and I was in charge of albums. They had a small section of current pop rock albums. This would have been in 1966, 7, I don't know. I was just either senior year of high school or freshman or whatever. And this fellow Paul Williams would come around with Crawdaddy, which was his project, mimeographs stapled together, just homemade. And he'd asked me, or the owner of the store, could he sell these for a quarter by the cash register or some other place. And I said, hey, we should do this, because I enjoyed it and I enjoyed him. And he'd come by and we'd talk. Actually, we would talk for hours, and he'd bring the thing over once a month and I'd read it. And he wrote a lot of it himself. And one day I just said to him, Paul, I can do better than this. I mean, why don't you give me something to write about? So one of my first ones was the Blues Project, and didn't like the Blues Project, even though there were very talented people in it. And gosh, I was tough on them. And then I wrote about Paul Butterfield Blues Band. I think I was tough on them too. I think I was just generally tough. And, from the Crawdaddies, I started to get requests for writing, in numerous places, and sort of perfected, being a rock critic, a record reviewer, a show reviewer, and somebody who's channeling a tremendous love of the music into writing. In 1967, Jan Wenner had an idea about starting Rolling Stone magazine, and he wrote to me, and he knew all my writing from Crawdaddy and other places. And he said, I want to make you my lead music writer in this magazine. And he had sent this beautiful dummy. It's like 8 pages that just sort of was meant to show what the magazine would look like. And you'd never seen anything like it. This was not an underground publication. He was aiming high. And he threw into the letter, he said that Rolling Stone, when it started, was going to pay for articles. That was a novelty in my experience to date, $25. And so there I was from the first issue, late 1967, maybe it was beginning of 68. And I was writing a full page, appreciation, review, criticism, was the lead music piece. And, that became my sort of home base for 10 years.
So you're in charge of this page, and you're going to have to create some writing. Where are you looking for new talent as the editor of this section?
Well, I wasn't the editor of the section.
Okay.
I was a feature writer, and the reviews themselves, I think that for a while, Greel Marcus, who I had not yet met, was perhaps organizing the section and was an important writer there. And he had brought in a bunch of fairly intellectual critics like Langdon Winter, very, very good, but sort of a little bit on the intellectual side. And I sort of was half intellectual and half, from the gut sort of writer. And my thing was that I was crazy about all Black music, Motown, Stax, Atlantic Records. That was my number one focal point. And I had said to Jan that my goal was, seeing as how I was sure that most of the rest of the writing about the music would concentrate on San Francisco bands at first and rock bands and so forth, that I wanted to spend a lot of time on Black music, because basically I saw myself, my father was a history teacher, and I have a little touch of the educator in me, pretentious as I may get sometimes. And so I was on a bit of a mission to get the audience, make the audience aware of Sam and Dave, or Otis Redding, or Aretha Franklin, or B.B. King, all of which I'd written 2,000-word full-page articles about, surrounded by articles by Quicksilver Messenger Service, Blue Cheer, and general San Francisco favorites, Of course, Greel in the record section and others there had broader taste, but in terms of the feature coverage. So I became fairly prominent as one of the early rock critics, and Rolling Stone became a dominant force and grew very quickly. Now, the thing about Rolling Stone is that it was so professionally done and so professionally edited compared to anything else that was going on, that it also acquired a reputation as sort of something of an establishment publication during the era where any notion of establishment had terrible connotation, whether it was really applied or not. And Cream magazine, where Dave, our man of the moment, started, was always looked to me like a reaction to Rolling Stone. Cream they were the punks. They were they were messy. They were loud. They weren't afraid to be ugly. They could be nasty. They could be brilliant. They were loose. It was sort of very much anti the sort of more conventional isn't the right word for Rolling Stone, but perhaps let's say that against the professionalism of Rolling Stone, which was real. Jan aspired to having a very professional presentation, real editing, you know, was in the tradition of magazines or magazine/newspapers, whereas I think Cream from the beginning was in full-fledged rebellion. That was how I saw it. Now I come to meet Dave, whose byline I had become familiar with and had appreciated sometimes and not so much other times. But in 1969, I found myself doing what I really aspired to do, which was to start to produce records. And the first record I produced was by the MC5. And there it is, back in the USA. Wasn't there an album called Born in the USA a few years later? I guess I like that USA thing. Anyway, I moved. I was at Brandeis University, and I was just about to graduate. And I did graduate, but I skipped my graduation and found myself in Hamburg, Michigan, living with the members of the band and their wives and other friends in a communal house for about 4 months, where we made the album. And where I got to know the whole cast of characters, including the legendary John Sinclair, who I know is speaking on a later panel. And Dave was sort of around this whole situation, this whole political movement and a political musical movement, however it was to be described. And we first met, I think, at the White Panther headquarters, living space, central location in Ann Arbor.
The Trans-Love Energies house.
At the Trans-Love Energies house, thank you. The band was already living separately at in this town that I seem to remember the name was Hamburg, Michigan, maybe 20 minutes away. But you know, there was constant back and forth. And so anyway, Dave and I met one day, and we just got to talking about writing, his writing, my writing, what Rolling Stone was like, what Cream was like, and just sharing our experiences up to that point. And, you know, our paths would cross, you know, during the process of me staying out there. You know, I was involved twice with the MC5. The first time was that our mutual friend, Danny Fields, who worked for Elektra Records, where the MC5 had been signed. Danny, they had signed the MC5 Elektra Records, Jack Holzman, and they sort of didn't know what to do with them. They had them, they knew it was exciting. How do you record them, you know? And so they fell back on the live album idea. And I had I don't know, my reputation was such that Jack and Danny came to me and said, we want you to do a consult. We want you to go see the band and not write a review of the band, but write us an analysis of the band and a recording plan. Why me? Because I'm so good looking. So I go to see the band, and I loved the band. And what I loved was the first 15 minutes. And in the first 15 minutes, J.C. Crawford, who was some sort of spokesperson, great guy, would come out and do this rap, which at the time sounded very original, now very cliched because it was used so much, essentially ending with, are you part of the problem or part of the solution? And he would be looking at the audience, the band would be lined up with their backs to the audience. And then on that cue, they spun around and they went into their first song, Ramblin' Rose, then right into Kick Out the Jams. And then I think it was a song called not Come Together. I forget the third one, but it was 3 in a row. Okay. The most exciting 15 minutes I had ever seen. Completely blew my mind. They did go on for another hour. And the trick is when you start there, where do you go? And it just never reached that height again, you know. That was my general impression. Anyway, I write up all these notes and different suggestions and ideas and so forth, which I give to Jack and Danny, for which I am paid, by the way, $500, which in rock writer world at that time was a fortune. So they take it all in. A great engineer named Bruce Botnick, sort of the house engineer, is assigned the job of recording the album. And it's going to be recorded, I think, at the Grandy Ballroom in Detroit. So they fly me out. They want me to be there, not in an official capacity, but to continue in my so-called advisory role. So I get there, and there are the guys, and they are all looking at this document. So I come over, and in my recollection, and maybe the guys remember it differently, but that truly great musician, Wayne Kramer, said to me, did you write this? Is this your shit? Because it was 10 pages long, and the criticism were really harsh because I didn't think they were going to see them. I was just, hey, this song is a mess. You can't record this song. And so, it's speaking to Jack and Danny. So I took ownership. I said, yes. So he said, well, it's pretty good. This is pretty good stuff. And then I observed them proceeding to go through it. I was very tough on the bass player. He could have strangled me, Michael, and but they seemed to get some use out of it. They go make the album, and that's the end of it.
Danny Field still has this document in his papers because what I think you talked about, you mentioned it in some other conversation, and there was no document I would like to get my hands on more than that. And his archivist shared it's with Danny's papers at Yale. So
well, Danny Fields is a person who was of extraordinary influence and importance for a number of years. Right at this point in time, he was a sort of facilitator, and he wasn't a publicist per se. He was a publicist, but he was more. And the ugly phrase that later came about, in which certain people were called company freaks. The idea was that Columbia Records would hire somebody who would be the emissary to to the parts of the music world that the conventional executives didn't have access to. Danny was so much more than that. And, he had a vision, you know, and he is a remarkable part of the history of the time. But anyway, so that ended my period in Detroit for the time being. And, you know, Dave and I guess, stayed in touch. We hadn't become close particularly. But then a funny thing happens. MC5 go crazy. They do some highly political shit that Jack Holzman, who was a good progressive liberal entrepreneur, found offensive, or perhaps thought it was going to kill the value of the project, and he just drops them like a hot potato. So Danny called me and he says, the MC5 are free. They're available. Jack just dropped them. Can you help? So I said, yeah, I can help. And I called my mentor, friend, Jerry Wexler at Atlantic Records. And I said, Jerry, this group, the MC5, he says, what the fuck am I going to do with the MC5? I know nothing from this. He said, what do you think? So I said, I love them. So he said, okay, tell you what, I had not produced a record. He said, I'll sign them if you produce them. I couldn't even believe what I was hearing. Called Danny back. I had become friendly with the guys in that last process up to a point. And that's how I found my way onto a plane on my graduation day at Brandeis, going to Hamburg, Michigan, to live with them for the next 4 months and make back in the USA. And back in the USA is, I think, an expression of the Motor City tone, the mix of music and a certain kind of revolutionary politics. No, I wouldn't call it that, but a certain kind of very overheated political activist outspokenness. And the song on the album, by the way, that to me encompassed the vision, not of John Sinclair, who had his own vision, which I respected, but was from the band, was a song called The Human Being Lawnmower, Chop, Chop, Chop. And that song is 2 minutes and 24 seconds. And nobody's ever put more energy or power into a 2 minute and 24 second record that I just love it. Loved it then and I love it now, you know, and that was Rob Tyner singing the best he ever sang. And it was Fred and Wayne playing these incredible guitar parts together that they could do. They were great, man. I'm very, very proud to have had some connection to them to this day. The single biggest omission among rock bands from the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is the MC5. And I've been involved in the Hall of Fame almost since it began, and I'm involved and really in charge of the process of induction, and that there is a myth that a few of us, such as Jan Wenner and myself, can push a button and put anybody in there or keep anybody out. And this is false. And the evidence for it is if I could push that button, the MC5 would have been in there 20 years ago. So I'm still fighting for them. But it's a committee, large committee and balloting process. Anyway.
Let's talk a little bit about Dave's thoughts about your work with the Five and back in the USA. Dave, I think Dave's, they were his friends, and I described it as his fierce and charmingly possessive approach to the MC5.
That's right.
So I'm going to just quote Dave here. A new force had emerged. He was exactly what the musicianly, star-bound part of the MC5 most desired. John Landau, their new producer, Mr. Rationality. It was Descartes meeting the Sphinx. Landau quickly became the major outside influence on the Five. The album that the combination produced back in the USA has his hand stamped on it as clearly as Kick Out the Jams was influenced by John Sinclair. But the Five were convinced, half by Landau, half by themselves, that what they'd been doing was improper or at least doomed to be ineffective. Wayne Kramer, before Landau came out here, we were an amateur band.
Well, first of all, right off, we can say that there's a young Dave Marsh writing so well, so clearly, with such perspective and accuracy, in my opinion, and I say that not because I'm treated in a positive way there, but because I think he is identifying the conflicts that were emerging. And here's what I wanted. I wanted to be part of rock music. I wanted to use my ability, such as it was, to help make great rock music. I was a somewhat conventional political person. I had, let's say, all the right attitudes and beliefs, but they were, in terms of when you're working with musicians and you find yourself in the studio, there were forces bigger than, political advocacy. Where it was exciting to me is when the musicians had a vision, and the MC5 did have a vision, and it was distinct from John's vision. And so there was a natural, leaving home sort of phenomenon going on. And I also was very interested in being successful, and I was tremendously interested in them being successful. And I think the thing that John either was critical of or missed is they were tremendously interested in being successful. They wanted to express their ideas. They believed in them. They were very committed, but they were also committed to the dream that every rock band that I have ever met and will ever meet is they wanted to be successful, on their own terms, but they wanted to be successful. And so we set out to do that, to do it all, to make a record that would be great and it would be successful. And we did some things right. We did some things, I did some things wrong. It was my first effort. It was their second album. It wasn't the deaf leading the deaf, but it might have been the blind leading the blind, but we got there. We made a record, and Dave's analysis, as so often, was just prophetic. And in the course of the album, making the album, of course, John was convicted, and circumstances just really changed dramatically from the beginning of that album to the end of the album.
Of course, the famous arrest that got Abby Hoffman knocked off the stage at Woodstock by saying John Sinclair is in jail for because he sold 2 joints to an undercover officer. So this is there's another sort of quote passage here. This is a quote this is something you said in 1969, and again, not wanting to hold you to that, but you said, I think that rock and roll in a lot of ways is bigger than that, politics. And then Dave's response was, Landau apparently didn't understand or agree that the MC5's politics were broader than rock and roll because they encompassed the music and on a good night transcended both.
Well, I think that Dave is a very strong and strongly expressed point of view. I think we can get a little hung up on the semantics. I would say that for me, what I respond to the most in all of the arts that I'm interested in, which is not limited to music, is something that I'm moved by and I'm inspired by, and that I feel is transcendent. And the source of that can be, it varies from every artist to artist. On a Bob Dylan, on Like a Rolling Stone, that feeling of transcendence is inseparable from the lyrics. When Aretha Franklin sings Don't Play That Song, a song originally recorded by Benny King and co-written by Ahmet Ertegun, it's not about the lyrics. It's not about the lyrics. The lyrics are just a vehicle for her to express a vision that's bigger than words. So, you take it as you find it. I don't think there isn't a formula for greatness. There is many different paths and many different approaches. I guess what I was saying is that a profoundly artistic experience, one in which you feel your soul being moved, can certainly include the political. I mean, for God's sake, there are a few songs more beautiful and more political than La Marseillaise. Not bad. That's not a bad one. But the political attitude or program is its importance in the process is highly variable. It's highly variable. Things aren't great because of what they're about. In Renaissance painting, everybody painted the same thing. Same basic images: Madonna and Child, the Crucifixion. That was you could say, the ideology of the time. Some of the paintings in sculpture were life-changing. They were phenomenal. And some of them are as dead as doorknob and of no value at all. Same subject. It's what the artist is able to do with it, to take it to a higher place. That's you're getting a little of just my own vision of things.
So to sort of build off of that, and again, I realize this is a thesis built over a lifetime of experience, but back then the seeds of it were there, And while you were producing, did you come across like a way to encourage the band to get to that place of transcendence?
Well, I had as a, I was an amateur musician. I played the guitar. I was pretty good. Had bands in college. I knew the music. I certainly knew the music better firsthand than most people who came out of rock criticism. And I had very strong ideas about music and arranging. And so what you hear on the MC5 album that I participated in is you hear that all that big flailing that's on the first album, all of the constant drumming and cymbal crashing and has all been simplified. And the beat and the sound of the record is very direct. It's very uncluttered. It's just nothing but the meat and potatoes of what's there. It is very unfrilly. That's what I like. I had two drum idols. One was Charlie Watts, and the other was Al Jackson, who played on every Stax album, every Otis Redding album. And these guys, they were just groove players. They would find that groove. They'd stay there. Every now and then a little fill. Basically, it was about just, as they say, being in the pocket and keeping that thing moving. And I took it to an extreme. And what was funny is that decade later, the rise of punk, not that I'm responsible, but a whole lot of punk music went in that direction. The Ramones just, that clipped, very direct, uncluttered sound. That was what was the Ramones, and that was the connection to the MC5. This album back in the USA, which didn't do particularly well here, and was mixed in a very eccentric way because I didn't understand mixing. And so it is a record with no bottom. It's a record that is so bright. It is so filled with sonic attack that it's just very unusual, and it's so compressed. And so it was forgotten, but it was resurrected in Europe 10 years later. And during the punk era, it was considered to be a classic album. And let me digress, and this is not germane to our subject, who we need to develop more, and we will in a minute, but should it be of use? So I'm in Italy with Bruce Springsteen in the early 80s. And the custom is, I was manager by then and record producer. So the custom used to be the thing called a store check. So you'd land, and what would you want to see? You'd say to the head of the record company, take me to the stores. I want to see the displays. I want to know that you're on it. It's just a store check. Sometimes you'd be shocked that here I am in Berlin and there's no records, but this guy, the head of the Italian company, became a great friend. He's waiting for me at the airport. And we get in the car, and I said, let me go to the hotel, check it. No, we're going to the stores. So he takes me to one store after another, Tower Records type stores, wall to wall Bruce in the windows, nothing else, absolutely nothing. So we see three of these. And I said, Fabrizio, I'm convinced, let's go get some lunch, get some nice wine, and we don't need to. So I said, no, you got to see one more. Takes me to another store. Half the store window is a door. One side is Bruce, new album, the whole thing. The other side is possibly every remaining copy of Back in the USA. And I go in the store, and it continues into the store. It's like an MC5 store. And this guy who did not, was talking to me through translator, and he was saying, I know you're most famous for Bruce. We love Bruce. In my store, you're famous for Back in the USA. That was the best review I'm ever going to get of that album. So to return to more, go ahead.
Returning to Dave, I was thinking about a comment that you had made about the difference of his writing between Cream and Rolling Stone. And you specifically mentioned the article about the Stones, the I call and call and call on Mick.
Well, when Dave goes to Rolling Stone, where I helped him become a freelancer, staff writer, eventually a music editor. Dave, we only had a few samples that you quoted of Dave's writing, but what we have to say there is that Dave was a complete natural. What was he good at? He was good at, first of all, he was a great phrase maker. Secondly, he had that sarcastic sense of humor, which when he had a grip on it, could be hilarious and make his point. And, he was very tough-minded. His writing was very organized. I went back and was reading some of the early writing, and I used to think of Dave as a little bit, all over the place. Not so. His writing was very focused right from the beginning. And what happens is when he goes to Rolling Stone, it really in my opinion, it takes a jump as in writing. Now, the article you're referring to is Dave took this very hackneyed idea of, and I think it goes back, doesn't it go back to maybe it was some famous article in the 50s about some famous reporter trying to get an interview with Frank Sinatra and going through all of this and never getting the interview, so it was a cliched idea. But Dave goes out in search of an interview with Mick on a Rolling Stones tour. And in the course of doing it, he meets every single person who works for the Stones, who he profiles effortlessly through one or two comments there. And no, he doesn't get the interview with Mick Jagger. And finally he's on a plane headed home. He's had enough. And Mick calls him with another phony baloney. He said, "Oh, if you only stayed for this," he was just more the runaround. And so he took this, as I say, this somewhat corny idea. And if you reread the article, as I did the other day, it's terrific. It's just utterly entertaining. It captures the ethos of the Stones, all the people around the Stones, the little snapshots he makes of the Stones. There's a guy named Jim Callahan a security guy who he just captures in 2 or 3 sentences, and who I got to know later on. And these 2 or 3 sentences are the guy. I mean, and there's one, I think from 1975 or 6, about Patti Smith at the
Mhm.
time of her emergence and creation of the first album, being signed to Columbia. And this is incredibly sympathetic and not uncritical, but very um, very understanding, and really sets the stage for the arrival of what is to come in the career of this incredible artist. And he's really on it right at the beginning, uh, in the making of that first album. Tremendous understanding and tremendous profiling. And so Rolling Stone, what happens at Rolling Stone is that Rolling Stone is edited. When you write for Rolling Stone, I was Mr. Untouchable. You can't touch my copy. I was a fucking star, and it made no difference. They'd outlast you, the editorial desk. And in Dave's case, his editor was a woman named Barbara Downey, who became Barbara Landau, and was editing me, among others, and was editing Dave. And she'd get off the phone with Dave in fits of exasperation. And Dave, in case anybody out there is not aware of it, including you, Dave, Dave can be short-tempered. And so he would get frustrated with all the direction and requests and changes. And I wasn't part of the conversations, except that I would then be talking to Barbara, and she's like, Dave, oh my God, Dave, but he would make the changes, or he would not. If he didn't make the changes, he would rewrite. He would address the point. And so his writing really tightened up, and I think became masterful. And when he turned his attention to book writing, um, with what I'm going to call the original Born to Run, there was another book called Born to Run, came out many decades later, but Dave had the original Born to Run. And this was a bio of Bruce that went up from the beginning through the river. And I reread it this last week. I hadn't read it in a long time. And it is so well written. And also the reporting and narrative is really just holds up tremendously. I mean, there's a very accurate. Dave was a terrific researcher. Bob Christgau, who was writing at Newsday, was going on a hiatus, and he arranged for Dave to take his place for a while at Newsday. And so Dave became the critic there. But while he was at Newsday, I think he really sharpened his reportorial skills, which were a requirement there. And I think that experience really sharpened his writing. And then when you get to the book format, which is another leap, because it's one thing to organize a daily report or a 1,500 word record review or a 4,000 word profile, but now you're writing books. That's a different mindset. Requires a bigger and more sustained vision. And the book he did write about Bruce in the late 70s, Born to Run, was an excellent book. It was a very fair book. There are a lot of controversial characters in the book, to whom Dave was very fair to everybody. But essentially, it's so well written. It's a page turner. It's just a page turner. You start reading it, you're going to read the whole thing. I mean, I read the whole thing. I reread it a week ago.
You can't put it down, and I think it's because it's the succinctness of his sentences are not ever too long. And there's an energy that, and the economy in that, I think, moves you forward.
The economy was him taking advantage of the multiple experiences that he had, starting with Cream and then writing record reviews there, starting to write record reviews at Rolling Stone, some of which I commissioned, doing the features at Rolling Stone, writing for the Real paper in Boston, writing news, a tremendous range of experience. And he made the most of every experience. He came out a better writer from each of those experiences than he went in. You know, and what was the hallmark of Dave's writing? Well, going back to the Cream era and the MC5 era and so forth, Dave maintained a political perspective. He maintained a bit of, sometimes a bit more than a bit, of a punk attitude, very no nonsense, low tolerance for bullshit, not afraid to say so, sometimes a little outrageously or with maybe a little more. Maybe it could have been with a little more subtlety, but that's Dave. And tremendous conviction about and love for music, which he really has a great understanding of. The other thing about Dave is he reads more than almost anybody I know. You can mention a book, no matter how obscure, and that you found and you're excited about it. Dave, you know, I was reading this book, and you know, he read it 2 years ago, and his recollection is tremendous. He remembers what he reads, and so he's immersed in language. He's immersed in ideas, all of it. But as we know to this day, the political side of things does interest Dave. It's always present, sometimes below the surface, sometimes more explicitly, and that's part of who he is. It's just part of who he is.
The Patti Smith profile, what
Great.
we were just saying about his consciousness, there's just one, I happen to have it at hand, and there's one particular paragraph that I remember reading it when it came out, and I'll read it and then we can talk about it. Then she got pregnant. The circumstances don't matter. She was in junior college at the time, but she had the baby without getting married and gave it up for adoption. Teenage pregnancies weren't uncommon in South Jersey. In fact, they are just the sort of thing which happens to normal, well-adjusted girls everywhere. And it's the only mention of that time. It's like he got to the heart of the matter. Like, this is the sort of thing that happens. It was the only mention of this particular subject in this particular era that didn't try to sensationalize it, and it wasn't a prurient interest. It was just, this is just a thing that happened.
Absolutely with you on your response to that paragraph. I think another way to put it is, in that particular case, and when Dave develops an empathetic connection to his subject, which does not always happen, but when he does, as he did with Patti Smith, then his writing, even when it can be funny or it can be, you know, he gets his zingers in there and everything, is filled with respect, which is what that paragraph to me is. He's respecting this person in the way that he is writing about that. The thing about that article is, I knew Patty way before because I was in New York for a while, heading up the New York Rolling Stone office in 72 maybe. And Patty would come up to the office and want to, she wanted to write some reviews. I think, we were paying about $20 a review or $30 or whatever it was. And I actually, I think she just, whatever worksheet she'd get, and especially work as a writer. So I started giving her reviews. She wrote one of a Todd Rundgren album. That was really a lovely thing. And, but what Dave caught, this is sometime before her first album, but Dave caught in that article, he caught that she was at the beginning of a career of a work life, a future of greatness. And he saw it and he brought it out in the way that he wrote the article. That's how I saw it. There was a predictive aspect to it without him making any proclamation. I've seen the future or anything, but it was implied.
Who would do that? Who would go out on a limb like that?
So, now he goes on to write, by the way, in his book writing, a lot of which was excellent, but he does go on to write this 600-page biography of The Who. And I was telling him, because I have the latest edition, and I was trying to reread it the other night, and the type is so small that I said, I said, look, you got to get them to reissue it with just a normal size type. So I didn't get a chance to refresh myself on that one. I remember loving it at the time. And of course, The Who was so special to Dave. He just so loved that band and he knew them so well. And
again, it's one of those things where he got it at a instinctual level that no one else really quite approached. And that was for good and for bad. I think sometimes he could go too far in the other direction. And Mr. Townshend's audio greeting that we heard at the beginning of this definitely touches on some of that. I know you wanted to talk about Dave's, Dave's political involvement, his social involvement. Wanted to talk about the Christian Carr Fund.
Well,
and
before we get to that very important subject, I was thinking about this particular occasion, and I wanted to just volunteer something here, which is that Dave and Barbara Carr, who has worked with me for since 1980 in my management company, and is the most important and dedicated person that I've worked with over the years, and a great friend. And Dave and Barbara were living together in the mid-70s, and I had been living in Boston, and I had hit a patch of bad luck, I would call it. And really was starting to spend time in New York and was a little lost what I was going to do. And Dave and Barbara, just opened their Manhattan apartment to me, and I was in and out of there for 6 months, and they were just the greatest of friends, just on a personal basis. And I had the honor in 1979 of being the best man at Dave's wedding to Barbara, and I screwed that up. And the way I screwed it up was that my wife, Barbara, and I we were recording on Friday night. Bruce was going to the wedding, but Bruce is always oblivious at that time to little things like, hey, we have to get up early tomorrow because the wedding was at 11 o'clock or whenever it was. And, so we basically were up all night in the studio working on we were working on the River album at that time. So Barbara Landau and I were friendly, very friendly with Annie Leibovitz, who had volunteered to photograph the wedding. But Annie was one of the greatest photographers of the last and this century, and an extraordinary person who we could do many hours talking about. But reliability was not her number one thing at that point in time. And so she had asked us to drive her down to the wedding. She was going to meet us at our apartment and we were going to take her there. And this is pre-cell phone. And so she's not there, and she's not there, and she's not there. And we called her the numbers we had, and there was no answer. And, we didn't want her to miss a thing. For one thing, there would be great photographs. But it starts to get later and later. And so I get there and I missed the actual ceremony, which is with the judge. There was another ceremony where I did get to perform my function as the best man. But Dave and Barbara, to this day, I feel very badly about that. And so I'm taking this occasion of this celebration of Dave to offer my final apology for this mishap.
It's on the record.
Yes. So one thing that I did, as you mentioned, Caryn, I wanted to talk about, which is, peripheral to Dave's career as a writer, is that, as many people know, Barbara and Dave and Sasha lost the daughter and sister, Kristen Ann Carr, a remarkable person 30 years ago. And what was so impressive about the family and about Dave is that the fund that they created, the Kristen Ann Carr Fund, which is incredibly vibrant to this day, they researched and worked on coming up with an approach that was beyond the typical and mere fundraising, which is often the approach that people take. And there is a fundraising component, but what they decided to do was to fund the training of a new generation of doctors in the treatment of sarcoma, which is what Kristen died from. And so the fund is a fellowship. People apply for grants. They come and they study it as memorial, but they make a commitment to, after a certain time, return to their communities, so that throughout the United States now there are doctors who have had training in this hard to diagnose and rare form of cancer where they had not been before. And Dave himself is the equivalent, I guess, of what we would call a hotline in the underground of people who come into contact with this illness. Dave's name is a name that will come up almost at the top of the list of people to call for guidance, finding the right doctor, finding the right hospital, information, which Dave takes every outreach opportunity personally. So that's another side of Dave Marsh.
And it's a particularly far-reaching one. Like you said, the approach to the foundation is different. It's not just fundraising, and sending the fellows back to the community means that you don't have to travel to New York or Boston to get care, which we can very easily tie back to Dave's social consciousness and his belief in equality.
100%. That's my friend, Dave Marsh.
Hi, everybody. Thanks again to Mr. John Landau for joining us and entertaining my questions. Wanted to take some questions that were posed in the Q&A. And again, if you have questions, don't raise your hand. Don't text me. Please put them in the Q&A and we'll be getting some of those. Hello.
Hi. And I just watched our interview together, and I realized that I didn't stop for conversation. And so I regret that, Caryn. It was a bit of a monologue. And the other thing is that I really don't speak that slowly in real life. I just happen to get into a very slow pace, but I meant everything I said. So I hope people enjoyed it.
You were on you were on a roll. You found a groove. So we have a question from Evan. How do you feel you and Dave Marsh made each other better as journalists and storytellers?
I think that Dave, his, what I call in shorthand, the punkish element in Dave, which another way of saying is a down-to-earth element in Dave. And when we would talk, and for many, many years, we used to talk endlessly. And the thrust of Dave was always to, what shall I say, attack my occasional veerings off into pomposity and pretentiousness. And so that's what I got. One of the things I got on my side of it. And I hope that Dave got some things from me.
Thank you. We have another question. We have a question here from Stan asking if you can remember a band or performer that you liked and Dave didn't, or vice versa, and how did those discussions or arguments go?
Well, first of all, the way they went was they got physical, because in the 70s and 80s and onward, we were prone in our own dialogue and talking back and forth to be extreme. We get it. There's something about the two of us together where we would just bring out extremism in each other. And I'm just trying to quickly think of an example. And oddly enough, nothing is coming to mind. Political arguments are monumental because, as I mentioned in our conversation, I don't know. I don't think of myself as a moderate, but we'd wind up in different places on different issues, let's say, and we'd have fun yelling at each other about that stuff.
A little bit of an inside baseball question, but it's a good question from Arlen Schumer asks, were you in on Dave's decision to delay Dave's Born to Run from after the Born to Run tour till after the Darkness tour when it was published in 1979?
And I'm just thinking quickly, but I don't think so. I don't think that had something to do with me. But I'm aging quickly, and my memory isn't as sharp as it once was. So I just don't recall it offhand.
Got it. John Kelly asks, what was your most important rock and roll lesson as a manager?
Well, I have a philosophy about this, big word, but my philosophy is that you try to understand and relate to the artist that you're collaborating with, and you try to help that artist bring out the best in who they are, not the best in who you are. You're collaborating with them on their vision. Sometimes you may get to play a large role, and sometimes you get to play a small role. But I'll give you an example, and it's a surprising one. In the 90s, we managed a variety of people. And the most unlikely of them was Shania Twain. And I'm a big fan of country music. And I'm a big fan of Mutt Lange. And I had been listening to her music because Mutt was the producer. And I loved some of her records. And she made a change in management. She approached JLM, a company. And I decided, I want to do this. Craziest thing. I mean, what could be more the opposite of what I was known for doing? And, I developed with her a vision of who she was and what she wanted to do. And that's what I helped her do. And we did things that with Bruce in a million years we wouldn't do, and nor would we do them with Natalie Merchant, who we also managed. But it's about the individual artist And of course, you have to relate enough to what the artist is doing to be able to develop that approach. But we had fun with her. It was a great time. It happened to be an unbelievable success, which was also enjoyable. But so it's very artist based. It's very much, do you make a central connection with the artist, and can you help them do what they're aiming to do, better? Can you add something to the mix? Can you add some salt and pepper? Can you add, some ingredient that may not be there that will help complete the picture? That's what I like to do.
I want to piggyback off of that to a question we didn't get to in our chat because it's directly connected. When you talked with Chris Phillips at Backstreets, you talked about being an observant listener. And I wanted to see if I could get you to just talk about that a little bit, being an observant listener with your clients, especially in the case of songs that they might either not want to record or seem to want to give away to another artist because they don't want to finish it, they don't see the potential. What do you think that you hear that they don't?
Well, sometimes very simple. And with Bruce, sometimes I hear a hit, which I like to have. And sometimes he hears that it's a hit, and he actually did in the old days. He didn't really want it. For example, Bruce wrote a song called Fire. This is my interpretation. This is nothing that he's ever said. But he wrote a song called Fire. In my opinion, that was going to be a #1 hit single. We had a great version of it. The song was just obvious, blatant. So 2 people understood that, him and me. My reaction was I wanted it on Darkness. His reaction was it didn't belong on Darkness. Now, I knew eventually that he was right. He was right. It didn't belong on Darkness. Talking about albums where you could fit maybe 10 to 12 songs on an album. There weren't CDs where you could have bonus cuts and sort of put things on there that are out of the sequence of the album. So, gosh, I hated to give that damn thing up. So he gives it to his friend, Robert Gordon. Robert records it. Now, you may know out there that the writer controls the first use of the song. Once it's been recorded with the artist's permission, once he gave it to Robert to record, then anybody can record it. They have to pay the appropriate, fees to the writer, but anybody can record it. So Richard Perry, nobody's fool, who was a very popular pop record producer, Robert Gordon's version comes out. Robert was not a mainstream artist. Not that many people heard it. Richard took the song and gave it to the Pointer Sisters. And along with Blinded by the Light by Manfred Mann, those are the 2 biggest, I think if you counted, radio spins or whatever the calibrations are, they may be the 2 biggest songs Bruce ever had, both via cover versions. And I would hear that Pointer's sister version, which I hated. I just didn't like it. Maybe I was prejudiced. And I just, every time I heard it, it'd be a little annoying to me that we didn't have it, even though I freely acknowledge that if you look at the Darkness album, there just wasn't a place for it. It didn't fit, it was something else. So I don't know if that's directly responsive to the question, but
no, it's good. Yes, it's a good example. I want to ask a final question on behalf of the steering committee, and it's about the heart and soul of rock and roll. Are there any entries in the heart and soul of rock and roll that changed the way you heard a song?
Gosh, Dave and I talked a lot when he was putting that book together. And I do believe that there are a few entries in there that might have been influenced by our discussions in terms of ideas I put out there. For example, I love Donna Summer, and I love Giorgio Moroder. And as a record producer, I would listen carefully to everything Giorgio Moroder did. And he made an album. Donna Summer left her Casablanca label, where she had all the great disco hits. And David Geffen signed her to the label he had at the time. And they tried to make a little bit more of a rock album. And so she had a song called, what was it? Stone Love, I think it was. I love this damn thing. And in fact, I was friendly with David Geffen, and I said, you got to put this out. This is a smash, this song, which he did, and it went absolutely nowhere. But I was crazy about the song, and Dave was working on the book, and I said, you got to put this damn thing in there. So I think it might be number 379. You can check for me, but it's in there. And it's a great record. It's a great, great record. It's just one of those little hidden gems that, little secrets, that, and God, she was a great artist. God bless her. So.
She was. It is not 379, but
Okay,
I will not take up. It's in there. I will look for it later. Thank you, John, for doing this and for being patient with me. And this has been fantastic. And Eric, I am handing this over to you.
That was wonderful. Thanks again, John, for both sitting down with Caryn a couple of weeks ago and for taking the time tonight for the questions.
I'll just sign off by saying that this is such a creative and appropriate way to honor Dave, and I'm thrilled to have kicked things off. So great to be here.
Thank you so much, and we're glad you're seeing the spirit and the output of what we're doing here. And thanks again to you, Caryn, for doing the interview. Thanks to our audience for such great questions. Sorry we didn't have time to get to all of them tonight. This session and all of our sessions will be available on our YouTube channel as well as on the Land of Hope and Dreams conference website. We have 3 panels tomorrow, Cream and the Origins of Rock Writing, On Listening, which I'll be moderating, and I'm really looking forward to, and a panel on Detroit and beyond. So bringing it back home for where Dave came from. Thanks again so much for joining us, and hopefully we'll see some or most of you tomorrow.